Greeks had lived in Asia Minor for over 2,000 years, but that history came to a bloody end thanks to the genocide committed against them by the Ottoman and Turkish governments. Alongside the Armenians and Assyrians, the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire faced a wave of deportation, dehumanization, and destruction during and after the First World War, which are remembered as some of the bloodiest genocides of the 20th century. Today, on A Day in History, we look at how the Greek population of modern-day Turkey was all but exterminated. This is the third part of our series looking at Ottoman genocides, so check out our earlier videos on the Armenian and Assyrian genocides to see a full picture of the unspeakable crimes committed in the last days of the Ottoman Empire. We also want to thank the Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian genocides were similar in many ways, but the defining feature of their victims was obvious: Christianity. These three minorities represented the vast majority of Christians who lived under the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Political events also put the empire's Greeks in a vulnerable position. Greece had secured independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1823. It was a deep wound to Ottoman pride, made even worse by the continual decay of Ottoman power ever since. As resentment against the new Greek nation simmered, it filtered down and fell upon the Greek minority too. The sparks of genocide began smoldering as early as 1908 with the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turks were a hyper-nationalist faction who believed in an ethnically Turkish Muslim empire. Their policy of Turkification left no room for non-Turks or non-Muslims, and soon every ethnic minority in the empire was in their crosshairs. In these last years of Ottoman power in Europe, Ottoman authorities harassed ethnic Greeks to encourage them to relocate to Greece itself. Episodes of violence broke out in areas like Thessaloniki and Macedonia, where ethnic Greek leaders were known to disappear, or where the bodies of Greek farmers would be found in the wilderness, left behind by Ottoman authorities. But such violence was intermittent and not yet systemic. The Ottomans mainly relied on indirect methods to engage in ethnic cleansing at this stage. Making the Greeks and other Christians leave on their own was easier and less likely to be condemned than removing them with violence. The Ottoman authorities therefore encouraged boycotts of Greek and Armenian businesses to economically and socially isolate them. These boycotts also came with episodes of violence, but disarmament politics enacted by the Ottomans sought to deny the Greeks the chance to protect themselves from it, and the legal system would certainly be no help. Meanwhile, the Ottomans resettled Muslims in Greek areas, and armed settlers at that, to put even more pressure on Greeks to leave. The situation of Greeks and other Christians in the empire was worsened by Ottoman failures in the Balkan Wars between 1912 and 1913. The empire lost almost all of its remaining European territory, save for areas of Thrace, to the Christian Balkan League, and it's perhaps this embarrassment that pushed the Ottomans to even more violent methods. Many of the empire's Christians did choose to flee in the face of rising persecution, but those who stayed faced a wave of intense persecution from 1913. Wholesale massacres occurred in Greek villages near Gallipoli by July of that year. One eyewitness reported villages being left without a house standing, and in others the population was tied up, executed, and burned. As with the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, the Ottomans employed irregular militias and unofficial volunteers in these massacres to give themselves some level of deniability. These methods continued into 1914. One Danish diplomat wrote in his report to his government of armed militias attacking villages and villagers being murdered in their fields or along the roads. The details of what took place are harrowing, he wrote. Women were seduced, girls were ravaged, some of them dying from ill treatment received, and even children were not spared. The goal was intimidation. Every village burned might encourage 100 more to flee. On 14th of May 1914, Minister of the Interior and functionally dictator Talat Pasha ordered the cleansing of Greek settlements all along the coast of the Aegean Sea. Local governments were told to encourage Greeks to leave voluntarily, but violence was accepted and inevitable. One victim of this violence was the coastal town of Phasia. Turkish militias descended on the town on June 12, 1914, moving from building to building, eliminating any civilians they came across. The violence sent the town into panic. Hundreds piled onto boats and fled by sea. Others sought sanctuary. A team of French archaeologists in the town managed to save several hundred people by sheltering them in buildings flying the French flag. But perhaps 100 civilians were senselessly murdered in a matter of hours, and virtually all of the population was forced to leave. The first phase of deportations and genocide between 1913 and 1914 led to about 115,000 Greeks from Thrace and 150,000 from the Aegean coast fleeing to Greece. Tens of thousands more were relocated within the Ottoman Empire, where they would either be deported at a later date, culturally assimilated, or in many cases, simply killed. The number of dead Greeks is not fully known at this stage, but a reliable estimate is somewhere in the tens of thousands. The storm clouds of the First World War were looming, which makes this a perfect time to talk about this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the greatest military vehicle combat game ever made. War Thunder lets you engage. The eruption of the First World War had a complicated effect on the treatment of Greeks. Fears of a Russian invasion causing an Armenian uprising in the east drew Ottoman attention their way. Talat Pasha ordered a halt to deportations and massacres in the western reaches of the empire, if only to avoid antagonizing neutral Greece. Still, the threat of an ethnic Greek rebellion to accompany an invasion by a Christian power, such as Britain, kept the Ottoman authorities weary, and they found ways to continue their genocide anyway. Although mass killings and burning of villages still occurred, the bulk of extermination occurred through forced labor and deportation, which became known as white massacres. Wartime conscription applied to Greeks, but arming them while persecuting them would have been foolish. Instead, young Greek men were conscripted into forced labor battalions, who were assigned grueling physical labor across the empire. These labor battalions were a tacit form of genocide. Cut off from their homes, underfed and overworked, many of the men who were taken were never expected to make it home. The targeting of men was a useful security measure too. Men were more likely to fight back if they saw what the Ottomans were doing to the women and children left behind. A problem easily solved by forcing them into labor battalions. A Greek diplomat who witnessed one of these labor battalions in 1917 sent a grim report back to Athens. "I saw those wretched men in the hospitals, stretched upon their beds or on the ground, resembling living skeletons, longing for death to end their sufferings." Casualty rates were so high that it was not practical to dig individual graves for everyone. The bodies of the workers who fell were dumped into mass graves, if they were even buried at all. An estimated 200,000 men were forced into these labor battalions, with perhaps 3/4 of them dying before the end of the war. The other pillar of the white massacres was deportation, in the form of the infamous death marches. Although more strongly associated with the Armenians, tens of thousands of Greeks perished on miserable marches to their new settlement sites. Remaining Greek populations who could not be removed from the empire altogether were relocated to the interior by foot. The logic was that the coastal regions were more vulnerable in the case of an Entente invasion, and dispersing the Greeks among the Muslim and Turkish population inland would help to stamp out their culture. Starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, disease, and mistreatment by the Ottoman or militia guards led to a high attrition rate on the death marches, leaving aside the intentional massacres that occurred along the routes. For more on the death marches, check out our video on the Armenian and Assyrian genocides too. Experiences of genocide often changed by region. The Greeks of the Pontus region along the Black Sea suffered especially harsh treatment. Here, the persecution was overseen by Topal Osman. Osman systematized massacres in outlying Greek villages across Pontus, often gathering the population of a village together in a church or house before setting it on fire, in order to save time compared to burning every building individually. Elsewhere, Greeks in the east, and especially those who lived in close proximity to Armenians or Assyrians, saw their genocides intertwine. Despite their differences in language, ethnicity, and the particularities of their faith, the Christians of the Ottoman Empire often shared the same mass graves. For example, in the province of Diyarbakir, an estimated 200,000 Christians were killed in a few months in 1915, upon the orders of Governor Reshid Bey, most of them Assyrians or Armenians, but among them were thousands of Greeks. By late 1916,